Sometimes the greatest courage comes from the smallest hearts. In 1876, 8-year-old Nizhoni was just trying to help her struggling Apache family survive another scorching summer in the Arizona territory. While searching for food near the sacred canyon, she found something impossible. A horse so big it looked like it came from the old stories her grandmother told. This wasn't just any horse. It was the biggest anyone had ever seen, standing tall as a tree with a coat black as night. The Apache called it the Great Spirit's messenger. But when soldiers from the nearby fort heard about the giant horse, they came with guns and ropes to take it away. Now this little girl had to make a choice that could save or destroy everything she loved. How could one child stand against grown men who would do anything to capture the greatest horse alive? Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The Arizona Territory, in the summer of 1876, was a land caught between worlds. Red rock mesas stretched endlessly under a sky so blue it hurt to look at, while ancient saguaro cacti stood like silent sentinels watching over secrets buried deep in the desert floor. The Apache people had called this harsh, beautiful land home for countless generations, their spirits intertwined with every grain of sand and drop of precious water hidden in the canyon springs. In a small village nestled against the protective walls of a hidden canyon, life moved to the rhythm of survival. Adobe homes built from the earth itself dotted the settlement, their flat roofs designed to catch every precious drop of rain. Smoke rose from cooking fires, where women ground corn on metates, worn smooth by their grandmothers' hands. The sound of stone on stone, a comforting percussion that spoke of continuity and hope. 8-year-old Nizhoni knelt beside one such fire, her small hands working to grind the last of their corn into meal. Her name meant beautiful in her people's language, and despite the hardships that had marked her young face with premature seriousness, the beauty shone through in her dark eyes that seemed to hold depths far beyond her years. The corn. "It grows thin, little one," her grandmother Itzar said softly as she stirred a pot of beans that had been stretched with wild roots and herbs. The old woman's face was a map of years lived fully, each line telling a story of joy and sorrow, wisdom and loss. Around her neck hung a sacred medicine pouch, its intricate beadwork catching the firelight like captured stars. Nizhoni nodded, understanding without words the weight of their situation. The spring rains had been sparse this year, and the summer heat had come early and stayed long. The crops that should have sustained them through the difficult months ahead had withered in the fields. Game had grown scarce as the streams dried up, forcing the animals to seek water in distant places. "Tell me again about the Great Spirit's messenger," Nizhoni whispered, setting aside the grinding stone. It was a story she had heard countless times, but one that never failed to comfort her troubled heart. Itzar's weathered hand reached into her medicine pouch, withdrawing herbs that filled the air with the scent of sage and sweetgrass as she cast them into the fire. The smoke curled upward in patterns that seemed to dance with meaning. "Long ago, when our people faced their darkest hour," the old woman began, her voice taking on the cadence of ancient storytelling, "the Great Spirit looked down upon his children with compassion. He saw their suffering, their fear, their need for hope in a world that seemed to have forgotten them. And so he sent a messenger, a horse of such magnificent size and power that it could carry the prayers of an entire nation straight to the heavens." Nizhoni closed her eyes, letting the familiar words wash over her like a healing balm. In her mind, she could see the legendary creature, black as a moonless night, with eyes like burning coals, and a spirit as wild and free as the wind itself. "But, grandmother," she said, opening her eyes to meet the old woman's knowing gaze, "that was long ago. Why hasn't the Great Spirit's messenger come to help us now?" Itzar smiled, the expression transforming her lined face into something beautiful and mysterious. Who says he hasn't, child? The spirits work in their own time, in their own way. Sometimes the greatest gifts come when we least expect them, to those who need them most. From across the small village came the sound of her brother's voice, calling her name. Joaquin was 16, with the lean build of a hunter and the serious demeanor of someone who had been forced to grow up too quickly. Like many of the young Apache men, he spent his days scouting the surrounding lands, watching for signs of danger from the military fort that had been built uncomfortably close to their traditional territories. "Nizhoni!" he called again, his voice carrying an edge of urgency that made her stomach tighten with familiar anxiety. She rose quickly, brushing the corn dust from her simple cotton dress, a garment that had been mended so many times it was more patch than original fabric. As she approached her brother, she could see the tension in his shoulders, the way his hand rested automatically on the knife at his belt. "The elders are calling for a council," Joaquin said quietly, his dark eyes scanning the horizon as he spoke. "There are rumors from the fort. The soldiers have been asking questions about our hunting grounds, about the sacred places where our ancestors are buried." Nizhoni felt her heart skip a beat. The sacred canyon, where she often went to gather herbs and pray, was one of the most holy places in their territory. It was there that the springs ran clear and cold, even in the hottest summer, where ancient petroglyphs told stories of their people's journey through time, where the spirits of their ancestors were said to walk freely among the living. "What kind of questions?" she asked, though part of her already knew the answer would frighten her. "The kind that mean they want our land," Joaquin replied grimly. "Father says we may have to make difficult choices soon. The other bands are facing the same pressures. The white soldiers and settlers grow more numerous each day, and they have no understanding of what is sacred to us." Their father, Nalnish, was approaching now, his weathered face grave with the weight of leadership. As one of the village's senior warriors, he bore the responsibility of protecting not just his own family, but all the people who looked to him for guidance and strength. "The council will meet when the sun touches the western mesa," he told them, his voice carrying the authority of one accustomed to making life and death decisions. "Joaquin, you will attend to learn what may be required of the younger men. Nizhoni, you will stay close to home and help your grandmother prepare for whatever may come." But even as Nizhoni nodded obediently, her heart was already pulling her toward the sacred canyon. Something deep within her spirit, a voice she had learned to trust even when she couldn't understand it, was calling her to that holy place. It was there, among the ancient red rocks and hidden springs, that she had always found answers to her most troubled questions. As the afternoon shadows grew longer and the village elders gathered for their solemn council, Nizhoni found herself thinking of her grandmother's words about the Great Spirit's messenger. In her 8 years of life, she had seen more hardship and uncertainty than many adults in gentler times. She had watched her people struggle against drought and disease, against the encroachment of a world that seemed determined to erase their way of life from the earth. But she had also seen the quiet strength of her people, the way they faced each challenge with dignity and courage. She had learned from her grandmother's medicine pouch that healing could come from the most unexpected sources, that wisdom was often found in the old stories that connected them to their ancestors. The sacred canyon had always been her refuge, the place where she felt closest to the spirits of her people and to the Great Spirit who watched over them all. Tomorrow, when the sun was high and the council had finished their deliberations, she would slip away to that holy place once more. She would pray for guidance, for strength, for some sign that her people would survive the challenges that seemed to grow more threatening with each passing day. What she would find there would change not only her own life, but the destiny of everyone she loved. The Great Spirit's messenger was indeed coming, just as her grandmother had always promised. And sometimes the greatest gifts truly do come to those who need them most. The next morning dawned with the kind of oppressive heat that made the very air shimmer like water. Nizhoni woke before sunrise, her small body automatically responding to the cooler hours when gathering food and medicine was possible. The village council had talked long into the night, their low voices carrying an undercurrent of worry that had seeped into her dreams like smoke from a dying fire. She dressed quickly in her mended dress and worn moccasins, careful not to wake her grandmother, who slept nearby. Itza's breathing was shallow but steady, and Nizhoni noticed how the medicine pouch never left the old woman's side, even in sleep, as if its protective power was too precious to risk losing even for a moment. The sacred canyon lay several miles from the village, accessible only by a narrow trail that wound between towering red rock formations. It was a journey that required both physical stamina and spiritual preparation, for the Apache considered it one of their most holy places, a site where the boundary between the earthly and divine realm grew thin. As Nizhoni made her way along the familiar path, she carried a small basket woven by her grandmother's hands and a water gourd that had been blessed by the village's spiritual leader. Her mission was simple yet vital. Find whatever edible plants or medicinal herbs the canyon's hidden springs might still support, and perhaps discover some sign from the spirits about the challenges facing her people. The canyon walls rose majestically. Around her, their ancient red stone marked with petroglyphs that told stories older than memory. Here, spirals represented the journey of life. There, human figures danced eternally around symbols of rain and corn. The Apache believed that their ancestors had left these messages as guidance for future generations, a sacred library written in stone. The path descended steadily into the canyon's heart, where a spring bubbled up from deep underground aquifers that never ran dry. The water was so clear it seemed like liquid crystal, and so cold it made her teeth ache when she drank. Desert willows grew along its banks, their delicate pink flowers providing one of the few sources of color in the sun-bleached landscape. But as Nizhoni approached the sacred pool, she stopped suddenly, her heart hammering against her ribs. There, drinking from the spring with an elegance that seemed to defy the laws of nature itself, stood the most magnificent creature she had ever seen. The horse was impossibly large, easily 18 hands high, with a build that spoke of both tremendous power and surprising grace. Its coat was black as a moonless night, so dark it seemed to absorb the canyon's shadows into itself. But it was the animal's eyes that truly took her breath away. They were deep brown, almost black, but filled with an intelligence that felt ancient and knowing, as if they held the wisdom of countless generations. For a long moment, girl and horse regarded each other across the sacred spring. Nizhoni felt no fear, only a sense of profound recognition, as if she had been waiting her entire life for this encounter. The creature's presence radiated a calm strength that seemed to resonate with something deep in her own spirit. Slowly, moving with the careful respect her grandmother had taught her to show all sacred things, Nizhoni approached the magnificent stallion. With each step, she whispered a traditional greeting, asking permission from the spirits to come closer to their messenger. The horse made no move to flee, even as she drew near enough to see the powerful muscles beneath its gleaming coat, to hear the steady rhythm of its breathing. When she was close enough to touch, it lowered its great head toward her, nostrils flaring slightly as it caught her scent. "You're the one from grandmother's stories," Nizhoni whispered, her voice barely audible above the gentle burbling of the spring. "The great spirit's messenger. You've come because our people need you." As if in response to her words, the stallion nickered softly, a sound like distant thunder. Then, in a gesture that would have been impossible with any ordinary wild horse, it allowed her to place her small hand against the side of its massive neck. The moment their skin made contact, Nizhoni felt a jolt of connection unlike anything she had ever experienced. Images flashed through her mind, vast herds of horses running free across endless plains, Apache warriors riding with impossible skill and courage, battles fought and won not through violence but through wisdom and spiritual strength. She saw her own people, as they had been in the old days, living in harmony with the land and its creatures, guided by visions and protected by spirits who took many forms. And she saw herself, somehow central to a story that was only beginning to unfold. As she stood there with her hand on the great horse's neck, something caught her eye near the water's edge. Half buried in the sand was an object that clearly didn't belong to the natural landscape of the canyon. Keeping one hand on the horse for comfort, she knelt and carefully excavated what appeared to be an ornate bridle made of silver. The craftsmanship was unlike anything she had ever seen. The metalwork was intricate, featuring patterns of vines and flowers that seemed to flow like water across the silver's surface. The leather was soft, despite obvious age, dyed in deep browns and decorated with small turquoise stones that caught. The light like captured sky. Spanish, she murmured, recognizing the style from artifacts her people had traded for or found in ancient battlefields. This bridle was very old, perhaps centuries old, left behind by conquistadors who had passed through this land long before the current wave of American settlers and soldiers. The horse lowered its head to examine the bridle, snuffling at it with obvious recognition. When Nizhoni lifted it questioningly, the stallion remained perfectly still, allowing her to slip it gently over its head. The fit was perfect, as if the ornate piece had been crafted specifically for this magnificent creature. With the ancient bridle in place, the horse seemed to take on an even more otherworldly appearance. It stood proudly, its bearing regal and commanding, every inch the Great Spirit's messenger her grandmother had described in the old stories. But their peaceful moment was shattered by the sound of approaching voices, rough, male voices speaking English with the harsh accent of soldiers. Nizhoni's blood ran cold as she recognized the danger. If military men found her here with this incredible horse, both she and the magnificent creature would be in terrible peril. "Circle around the North Ridge," one voice was saying. "The tracks lead down into this canyon. Never seen hoofprints." "That big," another replied. "Whatever made them, it's worth investigating." The horse's ears pricked forward, alert to the threat. Without hesitation, it moved to position itself between Nizhoni and the direction of the approaching voices, its protective instincts as strong as those of any guardian. "You have to go," Nizhoni whispered urgently, her heart breaking at the thought of losing this magical connection so soon after finding it. "They can't capture you. I won't let them." But instead of fleeing, the stallion lowered itself to its knees beside the spring, clearly inviting her to mount. The message was unmistakable. They would face this danger together, with trembling hands, and a courage she didn't know she possessed. Nizhoni grasped the horse's mane and pulled herself onto its broad back. The moment she was secure, the creature rose smoothly to its feet and began moving deeper into the canyon, away from the approaching soldiers, but also away from the familiar path home. As they moved through passages she had never seen before, winding between towering rock formations that seemed to close protectively around them, Nizhoni realized that her life had just changed forever. She was no longer just a little Apache girl struggling to help her family survive. She had become something else, the human companion to a creature of legend, a guardian of sacred mysteries that others would kill to possess. Behind them, the soldiers' voices grew fainter as the horse led her through hidden passages, known only to the spirits and the ancient ones who had walked these canyons long before any white man had set foot in the territory. But she knew this was only the beginning. Word would spread about the giant horse in the sacred canyon, and men with guns and ropes would come seeking to capture what could never truly be owned. The Great Spirit's messenger had indeed come to help her people in their hour of need. But as Nizhoni clung to the stallion's mane and felt the power of its stride carrying her into an uncertain future, she understood that the greatest challenges still lay ahead. At Fort McDowell, Colonel James Harrison stood at his office window, watching the morning drill with the practiced eye of a career military man. The Arizona Territory had been his assignment for 3 years now, and in that time he had learned to respect both the harsh beauty of the desert and the resilient people who called it home. Harrison was not like many of his fellow officers. While others saw the Apache as obstacles to progress, he recognized them as human beings trying to protect their ancient way of life. His approach had always been diplomatic when possible, forceful only when absolutely necessary. It was a philosophy that had kept the peace longer than many had expected, but it also put him at odds with territorial officials who preferred more aggressive solutions. "Colonel," came a voice from behind him. Sergeant Murphy, a grizzled veteran with skin like leather and eyes that missed nothing, stood at attention with a written report in his weathered hands. "What is it, Sergeant?" Harrison asked, turning from the window. "Sir, we've had some unusual reports from our reconnaissance patrol yesterday. They were investigating Apache hunting grounds in the Sacred Canyon area. Routine surveillance, nothing more. But they came back with a story that's gotten the men talking." Harrison raised an eyebrow. His soldiers were experienced frontier fighters, not given to wild tales or superstitious fears. If something had captured their attention enough to generate reports, it was worth investigating. "Go on," he said, gesturing for Murphy to continue. "They claim to have tracked an enormous horse, sir. Hoof prints unlike anything they've ever seen. Corporal Davidson swears the prints were from an animal standing at least 18 hands high, maybe more. They followed the tracks to the sacred spring, but lost them in the rock formations." The colonel frowned thoughtfully. Large horses were not uncommon among the Apache, who were renowned for their horsemanship, but 18 hands would make it a truly exceptional animal, valuable beyond measure in this territory where a good mount could mean the difference between life and death. "Could be a escaped cavalry horse," Harrison mused. "Perhaps one of the larger breeds from back east, somehow gotten loose during transport." But even as he spoke, he knew that explanation didn't feel right. Every horse in military service was carefully tracked and accounted for. The loss of such a valuable animal would have been reported immediately. "There's more, sir," Murphy continued, his voice dropping to the tone men used when discussing things they weren't entirely sure they believed. "The patrol came across an Apache girl near the canyon. She ran off when she saw them, but not before Davidson got a good look at her. Said she seemed frightened but not surprised to see soldiers, like she was expecting trouble." Harrison nodded. Slowly. The Apache were always wary around military patrols, but for a child to be alone in that area suggested either tremendous courage or desperate need. Given the reports of poor harvests and scarce game this season, he suspected the latter. "What's your assessment, Sergeant?" he asked, valuing Murphy's judgment after years of frontier service together. "I think there's something in that canyon the Apache consider important, sir. Important enough for a child to risk running into soldiers. And if there really is a horse of that size running free out there, well..." Murphy paused, choosing his words carefully. "There are men who would pay handsomely for such an animal." The colonel's expression darkened. He was well aware of the growing pressure from territorial officials to take a harder line with the Apache. Land speculators and cattle ranchers were pushing for access to traditional tribal hunting grounds, arguing that the natives weren't making productive use of the territory. A horse of exceptional size and quality would provide exactly the kind of excuse some men were looking for to justify more aggressive action. "Double the patrols in that area," Harrison ordered, "but instruct the men to observe and report only. No contact with Apache civilians unless absolutely necessary for safety reasons." "Yes, sir," Murphy replied, but his expression suggested he had more to say. "Speak freely, Sergeant." "Sir, if there is such a horse out there, word's going to spread. You know how these things work in a territory this isolated. Stories grow in the telling, and before long every fortune hunter and horse thief within 500 miles will be heading this direction." Harrison knew Murphy was right. In a land where news traveled by word of mouth and a man's reputation, could be built on a single extraordinary event. Tales of a legendary horse would spread like wildfire. And with those tales would come men whose motives were far less honorable than military reconnaissance. Meanwhile, in the Apache village, Nizhoni had returned home just as the sun reached its peak. Her grandmother took one look at her granddaughter's face and knew immediately that something momentous had occurred. The child's eyes held a new depth, a quality of experience that hadn't been there when she left that morning. "You found something at the sacred spring," Itzar said quietly, drawing the girl aside from the others who were busy with the day's tasks. Nizhoni nodded, her throat tight with the weight of her secret. "Grandmother, the stories you told me, they're true. All of them." The old woman's weathered hands trembled slightly as she reached into her medicine pouch, withdrawing a collection of smooth stones painted with ancient symbols. These were war paint stones, sacred objects used by Apache warriors to call upon spiritual strength before battle. "I have been waiting for this day," Itzar whispered, pressing the stones into Nizhoni's small hands. "My grandmother gave these to me when I was not much older than you are now. She said they would know when the time was right, when the Great Spirit's messenger would need a human companion brave enough to stand with him." The stones felt warm in Nizhoni's palms almost, as if they contained their own inner fire. Red ochre and yellow clay, ground fine and mixed with sacred herbs, had been used to create symbols that seemed to shift and dance in the afternoon light. "But I'm just a little girl," Nizhoni protested, though even as she spoke, she could feel something changing inside her, a sense of purpose and strength that hadn't been there before. "The spirits do not choose based on age or size, child. They choose based on heart, on courage, on the willingness to protect what is sacred, even when the cost is great." That evening, as the family gathered around their small cooking fire, Nizhoni's father noticed the change in his daughter. Nalnish had the warrior's gift of reading people, of sensing when someone carried news that could affect the entire community. "You were gone longer than usual today," he observed, his tone carefully neutral. Nizhoni glanced at her grandmother, who gave an almost imperceptible nod of encouragement. "I saw soldiers near the sacred canyon," she said truthfully. "They were tracking something." Joaquin looked up sharply from the bough he had been restringing. "How many soldiers? What did they want?" "3 of them," Nizhoni replied, her memory providing details she hadn't consciously noted at the time. "They were following tracks, looking for something they had lost or were trying to find." Her father's expression grew grave. The sacred canyon was well within traditional Apache territory, but the boundaries respected by the tribe were not always honored by the military. Any increase in patrol activity in that area could signal a shift in official policy that would threaten their entire way of life. "We will need to inform the council," Nalnish decided. "If the soldiers are venturing deeper into our traditional lands, the other bands need to be warned." But as the family continued their evening meal and discussion, none of them noticed the lone figure watching from a distant ridge. One of the soldiers from the patrol had returned to conduct his own surveillance, and his sharp eyes had noted the Apache girl's return to the village. In his mind, pieces of a puzzle were beginning to form a pattern that could prove very profitable indeed. The emergency council meeting was called for that very evening as the desert heat finally began to break with the setting sun. The village elders gathered in the sacred circle at the heart of their small community, their faces grave with the weight of decisions that could affect generations yet unborn. Nalnish took his place among the senior warriors, while the village's spiritual leader, an ancient man named Daklugi, prepared for the ceremony that would guide their deliberations. Daklugi moved slowly, but with great dignity, his aged hands steady as he placed the eagle feather headdress upon his white-haired head. The magnificent piece was a work of spiritual art, each feather representing a prayer, each bead holding the accumulated wisdom of countless ceremonies. The eagle feathers caught the firelight as Daklugi raised his arms to the 4 directions, calling upon the spirits of their ancestors to guide the council's decisions. His voice, though aged, carried clearly across the gathering as he spoke the ancient words that had opened such meetings for hundreds of years. Great Spirit, we ask for your wisdom in these troubled times. Help us to see clearly, to speak truthfully, and to choose the path that will protect our people and honor our ancestors. Nizhoni crouched near the edge of the circle with the other children, officially too young to participate, but old enough to understand the gravity of what was being discussed. Her hand rested on the war paint stones her grandmother had given. Their smooth surfaces warm against her palm. The soldiers grow bold, reported Taza, a scout who had just returned from ranging the eastern boundaries of their territory. They are asking questions in the trading post, wanting to know about our sacred places, our hunting grounds, the location of our summer camps. An elder named Bimisi nodded grimly. This is how it always begins. First the questions, then the surveys, then the claims that our land would be better used by others. Neelnish stood to address the council, his warriors bearing commanding attention even in this gathering of proven leaders. My daughter encountered soldiers near the sacred canyon today. They were tracking something, searching for something. They believed to be in our most holy places. A murmur of concern rippled through the assembled elders. The sacred canyon was not just spiritually important, it was also one of their most reliable sources of water and medicinal plants. Any military interest in that area represented a direct threat to their survival. What could they be seeking there? Asked Cochetta, an elder woman whose counsel was valued for its practical wisdom. The canyon holds nothing of value to white men, no gold, no silver, no grazing land suitable for cattle. But even as she spoke, Daklugi was studying Nizhoni with his ancient, knowing eyes. The spiritual leader had not survived to such an advanced age without developing the ability to see deeper truths. And something in the child's posture told him there was more to this story than had yet been revealed. While the council continued its deliberations, Nizhoni felt an irresistible urge to return to the sacred canyon. The connection she had felt with the magnificent horse was like a rope pulling at her heart, and she sensed somehow that the creature was calling to her across the miles that separated them, moving as quietly as her grandmother had taught her. During countless lessons in desert survival, Nizhoni slipped away from the village while the adults remained focused on their serious discussions. The moon was nearly full, providing enough light to navigate the familiar trail, but she moved with the careful stealth of someone who understood that danger could come from any direction. The canyon seemed different at night, filled with shadows that moved and whispered with voices only she could hear. But as she approached the sacred spring, her heart lifted with joy and relief. The great horse was there, waiting for her as if he had known she would return. In the moonlight, the stallion appeared even more magnificent than he had during the day. His black coat seemed to absorb and reflect the silver light simultaneously, creating an effect that was both earthly and otherworldly. The ancient Spanish bridle gleamed against his noble head, and his eyes held depths that spoke of wisdom accumulated. "Over lifetimes, I knew you'd be here," Nizhoni whispered as she approached. The horse lowered his great head to nuzzle her gently, and she felt again that extraordinary sense of connection that transcended ordinary understanding. This time, when the horse knelt to invite her onto his back, she mounted with more confidence. The moment she was settled, she felt his powerful muscles gather beneath her, and suddenly they were moving through the canyon with a fluid grace that defied the rocky terrain. But this was not an ordinary ride. As they moved deeper into passages she had never explored, the horse began to show her things that existed beyond the normal world of stone and sand. She saw hidden springs that never appeared on any map, caves filled with ancient paintings that told stories of horses and riders from the beginning of time, pathways through the rock that seemed to open and close like doorways to other realms. Most, Remarkably, she began to understand that their communication was becoming something more than human and animal sharing space. When she thought about directions, the horse seemed to sense her wishes. When she wondered about safe passage through difficult terrain, he would choose routes that answered her unspoken questions. "You're not just any horse," she said aloud, her voice filled with wonder. "You really are the Great Spirit's messenger, aren't you?" The horse's response came not in sounds, but in images that appeared in her mind. Vast herds of horses running free across endless grasslands, Apache warriors riding with impossible skill and courage, battles won not through violence, but through wisdom and spiritual connection. She saw herself as part of something larger, a story that connected the ancient past with an uncertain future. The horse, whom she had begun thinking of as Thunderheart because of the powerful, steady rhythm of his heartbeat, was showing her that their meeting was not accidental, but part of a plan that had been generations in the making. As they returned to the area near the sacred spring, Thunderheart suddenly became alert, his ears pricked forward and his nostrils flaring as he tested the wind. Nizhoni felt his tension and looked around anxiously, trying to understand what had alarmed him. Then she heard it. Voices in the distance, men speaking in the harsh tones of those accustomed to giving orders and having them obeyed. The soldiers had returned, and this time they had brought more men, more equipment, more determination to find whatever had created those massive hoof prints in the sand. "We have to get back to the village," Nizhoni whispered urgently. "They can't find you here." But as Thunderheart began moving toward the hidden passages that would take them safely away from the approaching danger, Nizhoni realized that their secret was becoming harder to keep. The soldiers were getting closer, their interest was growing stronger, and soon the entire world would know about the magnificent horse that ran free in the sacred places of her people. The Great Spirit had indeed sent them a messenger, but with that blessing had come a responsibility that would test her courage, her wisdom, and her loyalty to everything she held dear. 3 days had passed since the council meeting, and the tension in the Apache village had grown thick as summer lightning. Reports from scouts indicated increased military activity throughout their traditional territories, while traders brought disturbing news of land speculators and cattle ranchers pressing territorial officials for access to Apache hunting grounds. It was during this atmosphere of mounting anxiety that Thunderheart led Nizhoni to the most sacred discovery of all, a hidden cave system deep within the canyon walls, accessible only through passages so narrow that even the Apache had never explored them fully. The entrance was concealed behind a curtain of desert willows, invisible unless one knew exactly where to look. As Thunderheart guided her through the opening, Nizhoni found herself in a vast underground chamber lit by shafts of sunlight, filtering through natural openings in the rock ceiling above. But it was the walls that took her breath away, covering every available surface were petroglyphs unlike any she had ever seen. Not the familiar spirals and human figures she knew from other sacred sites, but detailed paintings of horses, hundreds of them rendered with such skill and care that they seemed to move in the dancing light. These were not the small, sturdy ponies typically associated with Apache horsemanship. These were massive creatures, depicted with the same impossible size and noble bearing as Thunderheart himself. And riding them were figures that could only be Apache warriors, shown in scenes of great migrations, spiritual ceremonies, and moments of profound communion between human and horse. "Grandmother needs to see this," Nizhoni whispered, her voice echoing strangely in the sacred space. That evening, she convinced Itzar to accompany her on what she described as a herb-gathering expedition. The old woman's joints ached with the dry desert climate, but something in her granddaughter's voice convinced her that this journey was essential. When they reached the hidden cave and Itzar saw the ancient paintings, she sank to her knees in wonder and recognition. Her weathered hands traced the petroglyphs with reverent care as she began to read the story they told. These are the old stories made real, she breathed, her voice filled with awe. The stories my grandmother told me, that her grandmother told her, going back to the very beginning of our people's time in this land. She pointed to a series of paintings that showed massive horses appearing at different points in Apache history. Here, when our people first came to this land, fleeing from enemies in the north, the Great Spirit sent the first messenger horse to guide them to safety. Her finger moved to another section. And here, during the great drought that lasted 7 seasons, when it seemed our people might perish from thirst, again the spirit horse appeared to lead them to hidden water sources. The paintings told a story that spanned centuries, showing how the Great Spirit's messengers had always appeared during the Apache people's darkest hours. But there was something else in the images that made Nizhoni's heart race with recognition. In every depiction, the spirit horse was accompanied by a child, a young person who served as the bridge between the mortal and divine realms. The prophecy, Itzar whispered, her voice trembling with understanding. The old prophecy that speaks of the final messenger, the one who will come when our people face their greatest trial. It says that this time the horse will not just guide us to safety. It will help us find the strength to protect our sacred places forever. She turned to look at her granddaughter with eyes that held both pride and deep concern. Nizhoni, child of my heart, I believe you are the one chosen to stand with the final messenger. But the prophecy also warns that this path will require sacrifices beyond imagining. As they studied the cave paintings more closely, they began to understand that the appearances of the spirit horses followed a pattern. Each manifestation had coincided with a moment when the Apache people needed to make a choice between surrender and resistance, between abandoning their traditional ways or fighting to preserve them. The paintings show something else, Nizhoni said, her young eyes catching details that even her grandmother's experienced gaze had missed. Look here, in the final images there are other horses, smaller ones, but still magnificent. It's like the Great Spirit horse is calling others to join him. Itzar nodded slowly as she began to understand the full implications of what they were seeing. The other bands, she said quietly. If Thunderheart has appeared to you, then perhaps similar messengers are appearing to Apache people throughout the territory. The spirits are preparing for something greater than just our small village's survival. Meanwhile, back at Fort McDowell, Colonel Harrison was dealing with pressures of his own. A telegram had arrived from territorial headquarters, carrying orders that filled him with both anger and dread. Reports of large horse in Apache territory confirmed stop valuable asset for military use. Stop authorize immediate capture operations. Stop use all necessary force. Stop. The message was signed by Territorial Administrator William Garrett, a man whose reputation for ruthless efficiency was matched only by his complete disregard for Apache rights or customs. Harrison had dealt with Garrett before and knew that the man viewed the native peoples as obstacles to be removed rather than human beings with legitimate claims to their ancestral lands. "Sergeant Murphy," Harrison called to his aide, who appeared immediately at the office door. "Sir, what's the current disposition of our mounted patrols?" Murphy consulted his duty roster. "We have 2 squads conducting routine reconnaissance, sir. But if you're thinking of organizing a larger operation—" He paused, reading the tension in his commanding officer's face. "Sir, if I may ask, what exactly are we being ordered to capture?" Harrison handed him the telegram, watching as the sergeant's expression grew increasingly troubled. Murphy had served on the frontier for nearly 2 decades, and he understood better than most how quickly situations like this could escalate into violence. "Colonel, with respect, sir, if there really is a horse of that size and quality running free in Apache territory, attempting to capture it could be seen as a direct violation of their sacred places. The Apache have been cooperative with our patrols precisely because we've respected certain boundaries." "I'm aware of that, Sergeant," Harrison replied grimly. But our orders are clear. The question is how we carry them out with minimal harm to all concerned. What neither of them knew was that word of the giant horse had already spread far beyond official military channels. The trader who had brought news to the Apache village had also shared the story at every stop along his route, and with each telling, the tale had grown more extraordinary. In saloons and trading posts throughout the territory, men were already making plans. Horse thieves saw the opportunity for the greatest prize of their careers. Wealthy ranchers envisioned the prestige of owning such a magnificent animal. Even circus owners were calculating how much people would pay to see a horse of legendary proportions. As Nizhoni and her grandmother made their way back to the village under the star-filled desert sky, they carried with them the weight of ancient prophecy and the knowledge that their small world was about to become the center of forces far beyond their control. "What do we do now, grandmother?" Nizhoni asked as they walked the familiar path home. "Now, child, we prepare," Itzar replied, her voice carrying the strength that had sustained her people through countless trials. "We gather our allies, we honor the spirits, and we trust that the same wisdom that has guided our people for generations will not abandon us in our greatest hour of need." But even as she spoke these words of comfort, the old woman's heart was heavy with foreboding. The prophecy had promised that the final messenger would bring salvation to the Apache people, but it had also warned that the price of that salvation might be higher than any of them could bear to pay. The talking stones were ancient beyond memory, smooth river rocks that had been passed down through Apache families for countless generations. Each stone was inscribed with symbols that held meaning known only to trained messengers, and when arranged in specific patterns, they could convey complex information across vast distances. Daklugi, the village's spiritual leader, had sent out runners carrying these sacred stones 3 days earlier. Now, as the sun set on another day of mounting tension, the responses were beginning to arrive from Apache bands scattered throughout the territory. Nizhoni watched from the edge of the gathering as her father and the other village leaders met with the returning messengers. The news they brought was both encouraging and deeply troubling. "The Chiricahua band near the Dragon Mountains reports the appearance of a great white stallion," announced Taza, who had traveled nearly 100 miles in 2 days to bring this information. "Their spiritual leader says it appeared to a young boy during a vision quest, and since then, their hunting has been blessed with unprecedented success." Another messenger, an elder woman named Nayeli from a band to the north, spoke next. "Our people have seen a golden mare of tremendous size near the sacred hot springs. She appeared to our youngest medicine woman and has been teaching her healing techniques that were thought lost forever." As the reports continued, a pattern began to emerge that filled the assembled leaders with both wonder and apprehension. Throughout Apache territory, magnificent horses were appearing to their people, always to the young, always in sacred places, and always during times of greatest need. But there was disturbing news as well. Military patrols had increased dramatically throughout the region. Territorial officials were pressuring local commanders to take more aggressive action against Apache communities, claiming that the natives were harboring valuable resources that rightfully belonged to the American government. "They speak of our sacred horses as if they were cattle to be rounded up," Nayeli said bitterly. "They do not understand that these creatures are gifts from the Great Spirit, not possessions to be owned by men." Daklugi raised his ancient hand for silence, his eagle feather headdress catching the firelight as he prepared to address the gathering. "The talking stones have brought us truth that both blesses and burdens our hearts," he said, his voice carrying the weight of years and wisdom. "The Great Spirit has indeed sent messengers to all our people, but he has also sent a warning." The old man gestured toward the patterns formed by the arranged talking stones. "The signs tell us that this is the time of choosing spoken of in the oldest prophecies. Our people must decide whether to fight for our sacred places or abandon them to those who would desecrate what they cannot understand. Nizhoni felt a chill run down her spine as she realized the full implications of the spiritual leader's words. The appearance of Thunderheart and the other sacred horses wasn't just a blessing, it was a call to action that would determine the future of her people for generations to come. That night, she slipped away once more to meet Thunderheart at their secret meeting place near the sacred spring, but this time she was not alone. As she approached the familiar spot, she was amazed to see other horses, not as large as Thunderheart, but clearly of the same supernatural nature, gathered near the water. There was a magnificent white stallion that seemed to glow with its own inner light, a golden mare whose coat shimmered like captured sunlight, and several others of various colors, but all possessing the same otherworldly presence that marked them as spiritual messengers. Thunderheart nickered softly in greeting, and as she approached, Nizhoni felt something extraordinary happening. The other horses turned to regard her with the same intelligent, knowing gaze she had come to associate with Thunderheart, and suddenly she could sense the presence of their human companions as well. Though she could not see them, she somehow knew that other young Apache people were having similar experiences throughout the territory, children and young adults who'd been chosen to serve as bridges between the mortal and divine realms, just as she had been chosen. "We're all connected," she whispered in wonder, placing her hand on Thunderheart's neck. "All of us, the horses, the people who care for them, everyone who believes in the old ways." The sensation was overwhelming. Through her connection with Thunderheart, she could feel the emotions and experiences of Apache young people she had never met. A boy named Chaitan, who rode with the white stallion. A girl called Ayana, who had bonded with the golden mare. Others, whose names she sensed but could not quite grasp. All of them were facing the same challenges she was, the need to protect their sacred companions while hiding them from those who would capture or harm them. All of them were struggling with the weight of responsibility that came with being chosen by the spirits for such an important purpose. But there was something else flowing through this mystical network of connection, a sense of growing power, of spiritual strength that increased with each new bond between human and horse. The Great Spirit had not sent individual messengers to help isolated communities. He had created a unified force that could potentially protect all Apache people if they had the courage to act together. As dawn approached, the sacred horses began to fade back into the canyon's hidden places, but not before Thunderheart had shown Nizhoni something that made her gasp with both excitement and fear. In her mind, she saw a vision of all the spirit horses and their human companions gathering in one place, a great convergence that would demonstrate the full power of the Great Spirit's protection. But she also saw the dangers that such a gathering would face. Soldiers, horse thieves, land speculators, and others who sought to profit from capturing or destroying the sacred messengers were converging on the territory as well. Word of the magnificent horses had spread far beyond the Arizona territory, drawing men from across the frontier who saw opportunity in what the Apache considered sacred. When Nizhoni returned to the village that morning, she found her grandmother waiting for her with an expression that mixed pride and deep concern. "You have felt the connection, haven't you?" Itza asked softly. "You understand now that you are part of something larger than our small village, larger than any single band of our people." Nizhoni nodded, still overwhelmed by the magnitude of what she had experienced. "Grandmother, what if we're not strong enough? What if there are too many people who want to take the sacred horses away from us?" The old woman smiled, reaching into her medicine pouch to withdraw a collection of small objects that caught the morning light like captured stars. They were beads of various colors and materials, each one representing a different Apache band, a different community that had agreed to stand together in the coming crisis. "Strength does not always come from size or numbers, child," Itza said, gently. "Sometimes it comes from the willingness to stand for what is right, regardless of the odds." The talking stones have brought word that all our people are prepared to protect their sacred messengers. The question now is whether we have the wisdom to act together when the time comes. As the village began to stir with the activities of a new day, Nizhoni clutched the memory beads her grandmother had given her and tried to prepare herself for whatever challenges lay ahead. The Great Spirit had chosen her for this path, but walking it would require more courage than she had ever imagined possible. The dawn patrol was routine, or so Corporal Davidson believed, as he led his small squad through the rocky terrain surrounding Fort McDowell. Their orders were simple: conduct reconnaissance of Apache settlements and report any unusual activity. What they had not expected to find was a leather satchel hidden beneath a pile of rocks near an old Apache campsite, apparently dropped during a hasty retreat. Davidson was about to dismiss the find as worthless when something about the craftsmanship of the leather caught his attention. This was not Apache work. It was military issue, but of a quality that suggested an officer's personal property rather than standard enlisted equipment. Inside the satchel, wrapped in oiled cloth to protect it from the desert's harsh conditions, was a leather-bound journal. The name embossed on the cover made Davidson's blood run cold. Colonel James Harrison, Personal Journal. By all rights, Davidson should have returned the journal immediately to his commanding officer, but something, perhaps curiosity, perhaps a soldier's instinct for valuable information, prompted him to open the leather cover and read the first few pages. What he found there would change everything he thought he knew about their mission in Apache territory. June 15th, 1876, received orders today from Territorial Administrator Garrett regarding increased pressure on Apache settlements. The language of these orders disturbs me greatly. Garrett seems less interested in maintaining peace than in provoking incidents that would justify military action against the native populations. Davidson frowned, reading further with growing unease. June 20th, 1876. Met privately with Apache leaders today. Their dignity and wisdom remind me of my own grandmother's stories about my mother's people. Strange to think that the blood of warriors flows in my own veins, even as I wear the uniform of those who would drive them from their lands. The corporal's hands shook slightly as the implications of what he was reading began to sink in. Colonel Harrison was part Apache, a fact that would explain his unusually diplomatic approach to dealing with the native tribes, but which would also make his position extremely precarious if discovered by the wrong people. June 25th, 1876. Garrett's latest dispatches make his true intentions clear. He has no interest in the reported large horse, except as an excuse to violate Apache sacred sites. His real goal is to provoke an incident that will justify seizing traditional tribal lands for his associates in the cattle and mining industries. I find myself in an impossible position, bound by military oath to obey orders that violate everything I believe to be right and just. Davidson closed the journal with trembling hands. In his 15 years of frontier service, he had seen corruption and greed drive policy decisions, but never had he held such clear evidence of a conspiracy that reached to the highest levels of territorial government. The sound of approaching hoofbeats caused him to look up sharply. Riding toward his position at a pace that suggested urgent business was a lone Apache girl, mounted on the most magnificent horse he had ever seen. For a moment, Davidson simply stared in amazement at the creature that had generated so many reports and rumors. The giant stallion was even more impressive than the stories had suggested, a living embodiment of power and grace that seemed to belong more to legend than to the everyday world of military patrols and territorial politics. But it was the girl's expression that truly caught his attention. She showed no fear at seeing an armed soldier, only a kind of desperate determination that reminded him of his own daughter back in Missouri. When she spoke, her English was clear and precise, learned from missionaries or traders who had passed through her village. "You must return this to the colonel," she said, holding out a small leather pouch. "He dropped it near our sacred places. My grandmother says it contains medicine he will need for the trials ahead." Davidson accepted the pouch automatically, his mind still reeling from what he had read in Harrison's journal. As his fingers closed around the soft leather, he felt small objects inside. What felt like stones or beads, probably Apache ceremonial items of some kind. "How did you know this belonged to Colonel Harrison?" he asked. The girl's dark eyes met his with a directness that was both unsettling and somehow comforting. "The same way you know that what you carry in your hands could save or destroy many people," she replied. "Some truths are too important to ignore, even when acknowledging them brings danger." Before Davidson could respond, the girl and her magnificent horse had wheeled around and disappeared into the maze of rock formations that made pursuit impossible. He was left standing alone in the desert, holding two objects that together told a story that could reshape the entire conflict brewing in the Arizona Territory. That evening, Davidson requested a private meeting with Colonel Harrison. As he handed over both the journal and the Apache medicine pouch, he watched his commanding officer's face carefully for signs of guilt or defensive anger. What he saw instead was resignation mixed with something that might have been relief. "How much did you read, Corporal?" Harrison asked quietly. "Enough to understand that you're trying to protect people who have no other advocate," Davidson replied, "and enough to know that we're both probably in serious trouble if anyone else learns what I've discovered." Harrison opened the Apache medicine pouch, finding inside a collection of small stones painted with symbols he recognized from his childhood memories. His Apache grandmother had carried similar stones, using them to communicate with other medicine women across vast distances. "These are talking stones," he said softly, his voice carrying memories of a time when he had been known by an Apache name rather than his military rank. "The girl, she's trying to tell me that her people know who I am, know about my mixed heritage, and that they're willing to trust me despite the uniform I wear." Davidson waited while his colonel struggled with emotions and loyalties that had been at war within him for most of his adult life. Finally, Harrison looked up with an expression of grim determination. "Corporal, I'm about to ask you to participate in actions that could be construed as treason if discovered by the wrong people. Are you prepared for that kind of risk?" "Sir," Davidson replied without hesitation, "I've been watching this situation develop for weeks, and I can see where it's heading if nothing changes. If there's a chance to prevent bloodshed while protecting people who can't protect themselves, then yes, I'm prepared to take that risk." Harrison nodded, making a decision that would put both their lives in danger, but which offered the only hope of preventing a tragedy that would stain the territory's history for generations. "Then we need to get word to the Apache that they have an ally within the military structure," Harrison said, "and we need to find a way to expose Garrett's real intentions before he can manufacture the incident he's looking for." The colonel paused, looking out at the desert landscape that had shaped both his Apache ancestors and his military career. "But first, we need to understand exactly what we're dealing with regarding these spirit horses, because I have a feeling that they're going to be the key to everything that happens next." As Harrison and Davidson began planning their covert cooperation with the Apache people, neither of them realized that their conversation had been overheard by an orderly with strong loyalties to Territorial Administrator Garrett. By morning, word of the colonel's divided allegiances would be racing toward Territorial headquarters, carried by men who saw profit in betrayal and had no qualms about destroying anyone who stood in their way. The unity blanket had taken 3 days and nights to complete, with women from 5 different Apache bands working together to create a masterpiece that would serve as both practical ceremony and powerful symbol. Woven from the finest wool and decorated with symbols representing each participating community, the blanket told the story of a people coming together in their hour of greatest need. Nizhoni watched in fascination as her grandmother put the finishing touches on her section of the great work. Each symbol had been chosen with care, Eagles for spiritual strength, mountains for endurance, horses for the sacred messengers that had brought their people together, and spirals representing the endless cycle of life and renewal. This blanket will be present when the sacred horses gather, Itzar explained as she worked. It will remind all who see it that we are not separate bands fighting alone, but one people united by common purpose and ancient bonds. The gathering place had been chosen after much deliberation among the spiritual leaders of all the participating bands. Hidden deep within the sacred canyon system, accessible only through passages known to the most experienced Apache guides, lay a circular valley that their ancestors had used for the most important ceremonies. Natural springs provided water, while the surrounding cliffs offered protection from observation by unwanted outsiders. But even as preparations for the great gathering continued, disturbing news was arriving from scouts positioned throughout the territory. Territorial Administrator Garrett had dispatched additional troops to Fort McDowell, along with a company of civilian contractors whose reputation for violence was well known among frontier communities. "These are not regular soldiers," reported Joaquin, who had spent 2 days observing the new arrivals from concealed positions near the fort. "They're hired guns, men who fight for money rather than honor, who follow orders without asking questions about right or wrong." Nalnish received this news with the grim expression of a warrior who understands that diplomacy has failed and that harder choices lie ahead. "How many?" he asked. "At least 30 additional men, armed with modern rifles and enough ammunition for extended operations," Joaquin replied. "They're also bringing specialized equipment, ropes and harnesses, designed for capturing large animals." The implications were clear to everyone gathered around the family's evening fire. Garrett had abandoned any pretense of legal or diplomatic solutions to what he saw as the Apache problem. He was preparing for a military operation designed to seize the sacred horses by force, regardless of the cost in Apache lives. "There's something else," Joaquin continued, his young face troubled by what he had observed. "Colonel Harrison seems to be having disagreements with the new military Commander Garrett sent. I saw them arguing outside the fort's headquarters building, and the colonel looked like a man being forced to choose between his conscience and his orders." Itzar looked up from her weaving with eyes that held both wisdom and deep concern. "The Talking Stones brought word yesterday that the colonel is part Apache. His grandmother was Chiricahua. If Garrett has discovered this, it would explain why they sent someone else to oversee the military operation." This revelation sent ripples of surprise and calculation through the assembled family members. A military officer with Apache blood would face impossible conflicts between his duty to the army and his loyalty to his mother's people. Such a man might be either their greatest ally or their most dangerous enemy, depending on which loyalty proved stronger. "We need to know which side he chooses," Nalnish said after a long moment of thought. "And we need to know soon, because the gathering cannot wait much longer. The sacred horses are already beginning to arrive at the hidden valley, and each day we delay increases the chance that our enemies will discover the location." That night, Nizhoni made what would be her final solitary journey to meet Thunderheart at their original meeting place near the sacred spring. As she had expected, the magnificent stallion was waiting for her. But his demeanor was different, more alert, more tense, as if he too sensed that momentous events were approaching rapidly. "Tomorrow we go to the gathering," she whispered as she placed her hand on his neck. "All the sacred horses, all their human companions, everyone who believes in the old ways. Are you ready for what's coming?" Thunderheart's response came not in words, but in a flood of images and emotions that nearly overwhelmed her young mind. She saw the hidden valley filled with horses that seemed to glow with their own inner light, Apache warriors and spiritual leaders from throughout the territory, and ceremonies that would call upon power not seen in the land for generations. But she also saw darker visions, armed men approaching the valley, violent confrontations that could end in tragedy for everyone. She loved choices that would demand sacrifices beyond anything she had ever imagined. "I'm scared," she admitted, her voice barely audible above the gentle sound of water flowing from the sacred spring. "What if I'm not strong enough? What if I make the wrong choice when it matters most?" Thunderheart lowered his great head until his forehead touched hers, and suddenly she felt a profound sense of peace flowing through their connection. In that moment, she understood that strength didn't always mean being fearless. Sometimes it meant being afraid, but choosing to act courageously anyway. As dawn broke over the Arizona territory, the final preparations for the Great Gathering were being completed in Apache settlements throughout the region. Families were making decisions about who would attend and who would remain behind to protect the children and elders who were too vulnerable for such a risky venture. Spiritual leaders were conducting ceremonies to purify and strengthen those who would participate, while warriors checked weapons and prepared for the possibility that they might need to fight to protect their sacred places and the mystical horses that had become symbols of their resistance. At Fort McDowell, Colonel Harrison was facing his own moment of truth. The orders from Garrett were explicit: lead a force into Apache territory, locate and capture the reported large horses, and arrest any natives who interfered with this mission. The penalty for disobedience would be court-martial, imprisonment, and the destruction of his military career. But as Harrison stood at his office window, watching the sun rise over the desert landscape his Apache grandmother had taught him to love, he knew that some things were more important than career or personal safety. His grandmother's people were preparing to make a stand for everything they held sacred, and he could not bring himself to be the weapon used to destroy them. "Sergeant Murphy," he called to his aide, who appeared immediately with the crisp efficiency of a professional soldier. "Sir, how many of our regular troops would you estimate are sympathetic to the Apache situation?" Murphy's weathered face showed no surprise at the question, as if he had been expecting it. "Most of the men who've served on the frontier for any length of time have developed respect for the Apache, sir. They recognize courage and honor when they see it, regardless of which side of a conflict it appears on." Harrison nodded slowly. "And how many would be willing to risk their careers to prevent an unjust action?" "That would depend on the leadership." "They were offered, sir," Murphy replied carefully. "Men will follow an officer they trust into situations they wouldn't face on their own." The colonel made his decision with the kind of calm certainty that had served him well in countless military situations. "Then we need to ensure that our men understand exactly what kind of operation Garrett is planning, and give them the opportunity to choose whether they want to participate." As both Apache and military forces prepared for the confrontation that would determine the future of the sacred horses and the people who protected them, Nizhoni spent her final quiet hours with her family, memorizing their faces and voices against an uncertain future. The Great Gathering would begin at sunset, when the sacred horses and their human companions would come together for ceremonies that had not been performed for generations. But whether those ceremonies would be celebrations of spiritual renewal or final rites for a way of life under siege remained to be seen. The hidden valley at sunset was a sight that would have taken the breath away from anyone fortunate enough to witness it. 5 sacred horses stood in a perfect circle around the ancient ceremonial ground, their coats gleaming in the golden light that filtered through the canyon walls. Thunderheart, magnificent in his midnight black, faced the white stallion from the Chiricahua band, while the golden mare stood opposite a paint horse whose coat seemed to shift colors like captured fire. But it was the 5th horse that truly defied belief, a silver-gray stallion so pale it seemed almost translucent, like a creature made of moonlight and dreams. According to the stories carried by the talking stones, this ethereal being had appeared to the oldest Apache band in the territory, revealing itself only to their most ancient spiritual leader. Nizhoni stood with the other chosen young people, in a smaller circle within the horses' formation, There was Chaitan, the boy who had bonded with the white stallion, tall for his age, with eyes that held depths beyond his years. Ayana, keeper of the golden mare, moved with the grace of someone who had learned to communicate through touch and thought, rather than words alone. In the center of both circles, Daklugi raised the lightning rod staff, an ancient ceremonial object that none of the young people had ever seen before. The crystalline stone, at its apex, seemed to gather and focus the last rays of sunlight, creating patterns of light that danced across the valley floor. "Great Spirit," the old man began, his voice carrying clearly in the still air, "we call upon the power that has guided our people since the beginning of time. We ask for strength to protect what is sacred, wisdom to choose the right path, and courage to face whatever trials lie ahead." As he spoke these words, the lightning rod staff began to glow with an inner light that had nothing to do with reflected sunlight. The crystalline stone pulsed with energy that seemed to flow from the earth itself, connecting the ceremony to power sources as old as the mountains that surrounded them. But even as the sacred ritual began, danger was approaching the Hidden Valley. Garrett's hired mercenaries, led by a man named Redmond, whose reputation for violence preceded him like a dark shadow, had been following Apache movements for 3 days. Their tracker, a renegade Apache who had sold his loyalty for whiskey and gold, had finally located the entrance to the secret valley. "There," the tracker whispered, pointing to a narrow passage between towering rock walls. "The horses will be in the valley beyond, but this is a sacred place. My people will fight to the death to protect it." Redmond spat into the dust, his scarred face showing the contempt he felt for anyone who stood between him and profit. "Sacred or not, those horses are worth more money than any of us will see in a lifetime, and dead Indians can't spend gold." Behind them, 24 heavily armed men checked their weapons and adjusted the specialized capture equipment they had brought for subduing large animals. These were not soldiers bound by military codes of conduct. They were mercenaries who fought for whoever paid them best and asked no questions about the morality of their assignments. In the Hidden Valley, the ceremony was reaching its most critical phase. The 5 sacred horses had begun to move in a slow, stately circle around the lightning rod staff, their hoofbeats creating a rhythm that seemed to resonate with the heartbeat of the earth itself. The young people who had bonded with them moved in a complementary pattern, their steps perfectly synchronized with their mystical companions. Nizhoni felt the power building around them like electricity in the air before a thunderstorm. Through her connection with Thunderheart, she could sense similar energy flowing from all the other horse-human pairs, creating a network of spiritual force that grew stronger with each completed circle. "Now," Daklugi called out, raising the lightning rod staff high above his head, "call upon the ancestors, call upon the spirits, call upon all the power that flows through the sacred places of our people." The crystalline stone at the staff's tip suddenly blazed with light so brilliant that it turned the valley floor bright as day. But this was not ordinary light. It pulsed and swirled with colors that had no names, creating patterns that spoke directly to the heart rather than the eyes. At that moment, Redmond and his mercenaries burst through the narrow entrance to the valley, their weapons raised and ready for violence. But what they saw there stopped them in their tracks, causing even hardened killers to stare in amazement. And something approaching fear. The 5 sacred horses seemed to glow with their own inner radiance, their sizes appearing even more impossible in the mystical light emanating from the lightning rod staff. Their young human companions stood beside them without fear, their faces serene with the calm of those who had placed their complete trust in powers beyond mortal understanding. "Sweet Mother of God," one of the mercenaries whispered, his rifle trembling in suddenly unsteady hands. "What are we looking at here?" But Redmond had not survived years of frontier violence by allowing superstition to cloud his judgment. "They're just horses," he snarled, raising his own weapon. "Big horses, valuable horses, but horses all the same. Take them down if they resist, but keep the animals alive. His men opened fire, their bullets whining across the valley toward the ceremonial circle. But something extraordinary happened. The shots that should have found their targets seemed to bend away at the last moment, as if deflected by invisible barriers surrounding the sacred horses and their human companions. Thunderheart reared up on his hind legs, his front hooves striking the air as he let out a sound that was part whinny, part roar, part something that belonged to no earthly creature. The other sacred horses followed his lead, creating a chorus of otherworldly calls that echoed off the canyon walls with supernatural force. Suddenly, the horses began to move, not in retreat, but in a coordinated charge that defied every law of physics and nature that the mercenaries thought they understood. Thunderheart led the way, his massive form seeming to grow even larger as he galloped straight toward the armed men, Nizhoni clinging to his back with absolute faith in their spiritual connection. The white stallion followed, Chaitan riding with the skill of someone whose bond with his mount transcended ordinary horsemanship. Behind them came the golden mare with Ayana, the paint horse with its young companion, and finally the ethereal silver-grey stallion that seemed to flicker in and out of visibility as it moved. But this was no ordinary cavalry charge. As the sacred horses thundered across the valley floor, they began to demonstrate abilities that transformed them from magnificent animals into forces of nature itself. Thunderheart's hooves struck sparks from the stone ground, each impact sending out waves of energy that caused the mercenaries' weapons to malfunction and their horses to rear in panic. The white stallion seemed to glow brighter with each stride, its radiance growing so intense that several of Redmond's men threw up their hands to shield their eyes. The golden mare moved with liquid grace, her passage leaving trails of light that confused and disoriented the attackers. "Fall back!" Redmond shouted, his voice cracking with the first fear he had felt in years of violent encounters. "Regroup!" At the entrance, but retreat was easier ordered than accomplished. The sacred horses had spread out to flank the mercenaries on all sides, moving with coordinated precision that spoke of intelligence far beyond that of ordinary animals. And their young riders sat upon their backs with expressions of calm determination that was somehow more unnerving than any show of aggression would have been. Nizhoni felt the power flowing through Thunderheart's massive form, but she also sensed something else, a restraint, a deliberate choice to frighten rather than harm. Despite the violence that had been directed at them, the sacred horses were choosing to defend rather than destroy, to protect rather than revenge themselves upon their attackers. As the mercenaries struggled to maintain formation while their own horses bucked and shied away from the supernatural creatures surrounding them, Daklugi's voice rang out across the valley, amplified by some acoustic property of the canyon walls. "You have entered a sacred place with weapons of war and hearts full of greed," the old spiritual leader called, his words carrying the weight of absolute moral authority. "The Great Spirit's messengers offer you one chance to leave in peace. Choose wisely, for this opportunity will not come again." Several of the hired gunmen were already backing toward the valley entrance, their faces pale with superstitious terror. But Redmond held his ground, his scarred features twisted with rage at seeing his carefully planned operation dissolving into chaos. "They're just tricks," he snarled at his remaining men. "Light effects and trained animals. We came here to capture horses, and by God, that's what we're going to do." But even as he spoke, the futility of his position became clear. His specialized capture equipment was useless against creatures that seemed to phase in and out of physical reality. His weapons couldn't find targets that moved like liquid light across the ground. And his men were rapidly losing the will to fight against opponents who seemed to command powers beyond mortal understanding. The sacred horses had formed a circle around the remaining mercenaries, their supernatural presence creating a barrier that was both physical and spiritual. As they moved in their measured, hypnotic pattern, the very air within the circle began to shimmer with the same otherworldly energy that flowed from the lightning rod staff. Nizhoni felt herself becoming part of something larger than individual consciousness, a collective awareness that included not just her and Thunderheart, but all the sacred horses and their human companions, the spiritual leader with his ceremonial staff, and even the ancient spirits of the canyon itself. Through this expanded perception, she could sense the fear and confusion of the trapped mercenaries, but also something else. A growing recognition that they had stumbled into forces far beyond their understanding or ability to control. The choice Daklugie had offered them was becoming more pressing with each passing moment. As the spiritual energy in the valley continued to build towards something that might prove overwhelming for those who refused to respect its sacred nature. The peace pipe of the ancients had not been lit for over 50 years, not since the great gathering that had unified the Apache bands against an earlier wave of territorial expansion. Carved from rare red stone, found only in the most sacred quarries, and adorned with symbols that told the story of creation itself, the pipe represented the highest form of Apache diplomacy and spiritual authority. As Daklugie raised the ancient artifact above his head, its polished surface caught and reflected the supernatural light emanating from the lightning rod's staff. The old spiritual leader's voice carried across the valley with a power that seemed to come from the earth itself. By the authority of our ancestors, by the power of the Great Spirit, by the sacred bonds that unite all Apache people, I call upon the ancient ceremony of unity, he declared. Let all who hear these words choose now between the path of wisdom and the path of destruction. The effect was immediate and profound. The sacred horses stopped their circling movement and turned, as one, to face the center of the valley, where Daklugie stood with the peace pipe raised toward the starlit sky. Their young human companions dismounted and moved to stand beside their mystical partners, creating a living mandala of spiritual power that seemed to pulse with the heartbeat of creation itself. But even more remarkable was what happened to the trapped mercenaries. As the pipe was lit with flame that burned without fuel, producing smoke that swirled in patterns that defied natural wind currents, several of the hired gunmen began to lower their weapons. The supernatural fear that had gripped them was being replaced by something else, a growing sense of awe and recognition that they were witnessing something sacred and profound. "I can't do this," one of them whispered, his rifle falling from nerveless fingers. "These aren't just horses. These are—" He paused, struggling to find words for what his eyes and heart were telling him. "These are messengers from God." Others began to follow his example, backing away from their positions and holstering their weapons. The spiritual energy radiating from the ceremony was having an effect they hadn't anticipated. It was forcing them to confront the moral implications of their actions in a way that bypassed their usual ability to rationalize violence for profit. But Redmond remained unmoved by the display of supernatural power. His scarred face twisted with rage as he watched his men abandoning their positions. "Cowards!" he snarled, raising his own rifle toward Nizhoni and Thunderheart. "They're just savages with tricks and trained animals. I'll show you what's real." The shot echoed across the valley like thunder, but as with all the previous attempts to harm the sacred horses and their companions, the bullet seemed to bend away at the last moment. This time, however, something different happened. The deflected shot ricocheted off the canyon walls and struck a rock formation above the valley entrance, causing a small avalanche that blocked the narrow passage through which the mercenaries had entered. The message was clear and unmistakable. Those who brought violence to this sacred place would find themselves trapped by the consequences of their own actions. As the dust settled from the rockfall, Daklugie began the ancient unity ceremony in earnest. The peace pipe passed from hand to hand among the Apache participants, each person adding their breath and prayers to the sacred smoke that continued to swirl in impossible patterns above the valley floor. But the ceremony was not limited to the human participants. As Nizhoni watched in amazement, each of the sacred horses approached the peace pipe in turn, breathing in the sacred smoke and somehow adding their own spiritual essence to the growing power of the ritual. When Thunderheart's turn came, he lowered his great head toward the pipe with the dignity of a chief accepting a treaty. As the sacred smoke swirled around his nostrils, Nizhoni felt a connection open between her consciousness and something vast and ancient, the collective spirit of all horses that had ever served the Apache people, stretching back through generations to the very beginning of their relationship. In that moment of perfect communion, she understood that the sacred horses were not just individual messengers from the Great Spirit, but living embodiments of the eternal bond between the Apache people and the natural world they had always called home. The ceremony reached its climax as representatives from all the participating Apache bands came forward to hold the unity blanket. Together, its intricate symbols seeming to glow with their own inner light. As they raised the blanket toward the star-filled sky, the supernatural energy that had been building throughout the evening suddenly burst outward in waves of pure spiritual force. The effect was visible across the entire territory. Apache people, in villages many miles away, saw the night sky briefly illuminate with colors that had no earthly source. Even in the settlements and military posts, sensitive individuals felt a momentary shift in the very atmosphere, as if the land itself had taken a deep breath and exhaled peace. But perhaps most remarkably, the expanding wave of spiritual energy carried with it a message that transcended language and culture. For a brief moment, every person within its reach, Apache, Mexican, American, soldier, settler, and merchant, experienced a shared vision of what the territory could become if its various peoples chose cooperation over conflict, respect over exploitation, wisdom over greed. When the supernatural light faded and normal evening darkness returned to the valley, a profound change had occurred. The trapped mercenaries found themselves face to face, not with enemies to be conquered, but with fellow human beings whose dignity and spiritual strength commanded respect. "We're done here," announced the mercenary who had first laid down his weapon. "Whatever Garrett is paying us, it's not worth this. These people deserve to be left in peace." One by one, the other hired gunmen began to nod in agreement. They had come to the valley, seeking profit through violence, but the ceremony had shown them a different path, one that led away from the sacred places and back toward their own long-neglected consciences. Only Redmond remained defiant, his weapon still raised and his face twisted with unrepentant rage. But he now stood alone, abandoned by his own men and facing the unified spiritual power of the Apache nation. The choice he made in the next few moments would determine not just his own fate, but the future of the entire territory. 1 year later, the Arizona Territory had become a very different place from the land of conflict and tension that had existed before the Great Gathering in the Sacred Valley. The memory beads that now adorned Nizhoni's ceremonial dress told the story of that transformation, each intricate bead representing a moment when courage had triumphed over fear, wisdom over ignorance, unity over division. The morning sun cast long shadows across the peaceful Apache village as Nizhoni, now 9 years old, but carrying herself with the dignity of someone who had faced extraordinary trials, prepared for the day's most important ceremony. Today marked the first anniversary of the Great Gathering, and Apache people from across the territory would come together once again, not in desperate defense of their sacred places, but in celebration of the new harmony that had emerged from that night of spiritual power. Colonel Harrison, who had officially resigned his military commission and been appointed as the first Native Relations Coordinator for the territorial government, arrived at midday with news that still seemed miraculous, despite a full year of gradual implementation. "The federal treaty has been signed and ratified," he announced to the assembled village leaders, his face showing the quiet satisfaction of a man who had found his true calling, the sacred canyon and all traditional Apache spiritual sites within. A 50-mile radius are now permanently protected from development or military interference. The treaty had been the direct result of the events in the Hidden Valley, when the testimony of reformed mercenaries, honest soldiers, and even territorial officials who had witnessed the supernatural events had combined to expose Garrett's corrupt schemes. The scandal that followed had reached all the way to Washington, leading to investigations that resulted in new policies protecting indigenous sacred sites throughout the American territories. "And the horses?" asked Nalnish, though he already suspected he knew the answer. Harrison smiled. "They appear when they're needed, just as the old stories always promised. The Chiricahua Band reports that their white stallion helped guide a lost hunting party to safety just last week. The golden mare appeared to the women gathering medicinal herbs after the spring flood, showing them which plants were safe to use. For healing." Nizhoni nodded, understanding that this was exactly as it should be. Thunderheart still visited her regularly, but their relationship had evolved beyond the desperate partnership of that first crisis. Now he came as a teacher and guide, helping her develop the spiritual gifts that would make her a bridge between the traditional Apache ways and the new world they were all learning to navigate together. The memory beads caught the sunlight as she moved, each one crafted with exquisite care by the women of her extended family. There were beads representing the night of the great gathering, the moment when the mercenaries laid down their weapons, the ceremony that had unified the Apache bands, and the long months of negotiation that had followed. But there were also beads for smaller victories, the first school built with joint Apache and territorial government funding, the successful harvest that had followed the spring when both communities worked together to manage water rights, the marriages between young people from different bands who had met during the unity celebrations. "Tell us the story again, grandmother," requested a group of children who had gathered around Itza as she sat weaving in the afternoon shade. Though they had heard it countless times, they never tired of the tale of their brave young kinswoman and the great horse who had helped save their people. Itza smiled, setting aside her weaving to give the children her full attention. At her age, she understood that stories were not just entertainment, but the means by which wisdom was passed from generation to generation. "It began," she said in the cadence of the traditional storyteller, "with a little girl who was brave enough to trust in the old ways when everyone around her was afraid. She had no weapons except courage, no army except one magnificent horse, and no strategy except faith that the Great Spirit would provide what was needed when it was needed most." As the old woman spoke, Nizhoni found herself thinking about all the lessons she had learned during that extraordinary year. She had discovered that courage wasn't the absence of fear, but the willingness to act rightly despite being afraid. She had learned that true strength often came not from fighting, but from bringing people together, not from conquering, but from protecting. Most importantly, she had learned that even the smallest person could make a difference when they acted, with pure intentions and trusted in powers greater than themselves. The sound of approaching hoofbeats caused everyone to look up with smiles of recognition and welcome. Thunderheart appeared at the edge of the village, magnificent as ever, but moving with the calm dignity of a creature whose purpose had been fulfilled. Behind him, barely visible unless one knew exactly where to look, the other sacred horses could be glimpsed among the desert rocks and shadows. As Nizhoni approached her old friend and companion, she carried in her hands a new memory bead, this one crafted from rare turquoise and silver, representing not the past, but the future that stretched ahead of them all. "Thank you," she whispered, as she placed her hand on Thunderheart's neck, feeling once again the profound connection that had changed both their lives. Thank you for teaching me that even the impossible becomes possible when people choose love over fear, unity over division, wisdom over ignorance. The great horse lowered his head to touch her forehead gently, and in that moment she felt a final message flowing through their spiritual bond. The emergency that had brought him was over, but the connection they had forged would endure forever. He would always be there when truly needed, ready to carry prayers from earth to heaven and bring divine guidance back to those who remembered how to listen. As the sun set over the Arizona territory that evening, painting the desert landscape, in shades of gold and crimson, the Apache people gathered once more around their cooking fires. But now they did so with hearts full of hope rather than fear, confident that they had found a way to honor their ancestors while building bridges to a future that held room for all peoples who chose to walk the path of respect and understanding. The memory beads would record this story for generations yet to come, ensuring that children not yet born would know how courage, wisdom, and unity had triumphed over forces that seemed overwhelming. And sometimes, when the need was truly great and the cause truly just, those children would look to the horizon and see a magnificent horse running free across the endless desert, carrying the dreams and prayers of all who remembered that even the smallest hearts can change the world.